urgency of the debate. The fact that we are here on this panel together and every single minister has said that there is an urgency to also debate the EU side and not only the candidate side is a huge progress. And why is that so? Because I do believe that when we had our first discussions in January, that was just before the first anniversary of, or the first year after Russia's full-scale invasion or aggression towards Ukraine. And I think the recognition now in Europe is very broad that there is no easy solution to this war because there's a clear aggressor that denies one European neighboring country the right, or wants to deny it the right to exist. And that we have to respond to that politically, and enlargement is one of the answers, but of course there are other answers before Ukraine can be a full member of the EU. So policy has moved much more to the center, and not only the security dimension and the energy dimension, but also other areas. So already I do believe that something has changed, and that is the thinking of the EU 27, accession countries, pre-accession policies, and then full membership. So I think this notion of thinking more flexibly definitely has to apply to the EU internally when we have 27 or more members, but it also has to apply to our thinking of applying our policies to our neighbors in view of preparing them for accession, or even if they are neighbors who will not be members of the European Union. So one of the other changes that we have seen now is 2 meetings of the European political community, which basically brings together countries on eyes level, which is not so for most candidate countries, that they actually have the chance to speak with other European leaders beyond the negotiation situation. So I do think there's a really fundamental political recognition that the geopolitics on our continent have changed, and that there's a real threat. Now, given the sense of urgency, I wish to give a few, because you asked so clearly, a few sort of insights into our thinking about how reforms can be introduced. Of course, the short term matters a lot, right? And so we are looking into any reform that can be implemented and make sense for, the goals that I've named, for the EU to adopt with the current treaty base. And quite a lot can actually be done. If you look into the treaties, the composition of the Commission and other things, they are treaty bases that serve to think through how can the institutions and also the relationship between institutions be adjusted. And then there are accession treaties. Accession treaties can add to EU primary law if you introduce certain changes that are directly linked to the fact that new members are joining. So that is sort of the second step where there can be changes to primary law. But of course, we also ask ourselves, should we look at the big picture and what are other goals? But that is really beyond enlargement, I would say. That is a longer term conversation if the EU wants to review its own functioning much more fundamentally. Now, as a personal comment, which I want to add on that notion of differentiation, I think this may lead us to a moment of truth, because eventually the differentiation is not only going to be countries are joining the EU but may not necessarily want to join all bits and pieces, so they might be less integrated. But at some point the political conversation has to happen. What is the actual core of the EU? Not only in terms of country names, but also what that core is defined by. And here the value space, the principles that are enshrined in the EU treaties come to play. Rule of law plays a big role in our discussions. We do look at the problems the EU is facing at the moment internally in implementing its own principles. And there is, of course, a huge question to be answered politically at some point. If that consensus within the EU is no longer given, then how do you deal with that? That has to happen before accession, because right now I think the treaties are very clear, right? And the EU, in its negotiations with candidates, projects those values and norms, rightly so. So part of our work indeed focuses on the question, what can be done to make it clearer and more effective to protect those principles within the legal and institutional framework of the EU as it is today. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. For somewhat of a preview, I think that was a good overview, and I appreciate that. I know you can't. We're all looking forward to the presentation later on in September. We have about 15 minutes to go. Get your questions ready. I do want to push Minister Boone on the how-to one more time, and especially on decision making. And the question of unanimity, qualified majority voting, and how you are thinking about that from Paris, and especially the element of the reservations of some member states, especially on the smaller member state side, about such a move into areas like common foreign and security policy, taxation, and other complex areas. So an easy one for you.
Thank you, I appreciate. So I also appreciate that you managed to make Daniela speak, and we get some sort of a preview here. I think there's one additional thing has shifted. So first, perhaps let me give you a bit of insight. The reason why France and Germany and many others the reason why we set up this group of experts was to start a discussion. It was to trigger the discussion across the EU. So Daniela and her co-worker started in January. Then we had a discussion in Brussels. Jessica, Thiago, Marcos has always been very also eager, and now here, so Denmark. So, you know, this is spreading, and I think it's an important discussion we need to have, a political discussion, as Daniela was saying. So in that sense, I think we've already achieved something, and that is very good. And then I'm looking forward to the option. The second thing which I think has shifted is the importance of the rule of law. Before you said rule of law and people started snoring. But really what we're talking about here, it's independence of justice, it's plurality and independence of media, it's the fight against corruption, it's the funding of political parties. It's just crucial. And this, and my colleagues may disagree or agree, but this has risen in importance tremendously. And we're now putting that on top of the list. And I think that is something crucial because it comes to the discussion of the core that Daniela was mentioning. I mean, let's face it, we don't always agree, right? We don't. We do manage to find a consensus, but you're asking about qualified majority, you're asking about the defense policy or taxation. We do not want that, and Maya mentioned it. Every country has the right to express itself, but we have an issue when one country is blocking everything. And we do have to address this issue. That's why we need to talk about this voting, or that's why the way we take a decision. But, and I think Thiago and Jessica mentioned it, why do they block, right? Why does one country feel the need of blocking? But perhaps because they don't have the same vision of the European Union as the others. And if that's the case, if it's a different vision of policies, of what the EU is there for, then we need to have a discussion of policy, about policies. And very frankly, I think we will have it. We want to avoid it. We will have it very soon, because not every country sees ever closer union. Not every country wants to be part of a core group. So, and in a way, I think Thiago mentioned differentiation. What do we mean when we talk about differentiation? We just mean simply that some countries want to do more things together, and others do not. And these others who do not, it's perfectly respectable, but they should not block those who do want to do more things together. That's when we are going to have a very interesting discussion.
I assume not in the next 12 months altogether. Okay. Would love to have questions from the audience. Be short and concise, question marks at the end. We'll start with Natalie.
So my Natalie Tocci. I just wanted to come back to this issue of reform and rule of law as an element. Because on the one hand, the reason why we're having this enlargement conversation now, as opposed to pretending to have an enlargement conversation in previous years, right, is because the security strategic rationale is back. So we know that there is no alternative, or rather the alternative leads to terrible things, right? Now, if enlargement is going to happen, in a sense, there is a strategic rationale driving it, which is different from a transformative rationale driving enlargement. So there is a tension between transformation, or a potential tension between transformation and the security rationale. Because if it's going to happen anyway, then one could say, well, it would happen regardless of what those countries look internally. So how do you address that tension which is inbuilt in these two contrasting rationales to enlargement?
We'll take one more question from the colleague to your left, immediately here.
Thank you very much, Sabine Lange. I'd like to pick up on something from Ms. Gabriel, and you mentioned the fear of the member states. And it's quite clear to me that in order to go beyond, or we need to deconstruct those fears in order to surpass them and to come to anything in the future. So I was wondering if the panel could tell us your observations, your sense of the fear of, and especially off the table and on the table by the member states. Obviously not your own, but your observations of which fears are there. It's quite clear to me that the perspectives are very different, and if Mr. Sciarto mentions that the enlargement could happen tomorrow, and I could see all your faces, clearly we have a variety of fears here, so I'd be very appreciative of that. Thank you.
All right, nothing like a little bit of fear. I think we're going to run to that question along the panel real quick as a closing, as we're running out of time. So starting with you, Secretary Stutzen.
Thank you very much. And I'll try to answer both, but also I would like to go back to what Tiago mentioned. And we have discussion, reform in order to enlarge, or reform and enlarge. We have this discussion basically every month because we sit together at the General Affairs Council, and that's one of the rare points where we don't agree. And I would also agree with Sabina that yes, when we come to the question of the enlargement and reform, there are fears that we need to definitely address. But one thing for me here is crucial. What Hungarian minister said, enlargement process is actually failed in the last decade. It was very successful 20 years ago with the Big Bang enlargement and Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia then, but then it suddenly didn't work anymore. And the last opening of the chapters was 2 years ago during our EU presidency with Serbia. Since then, actually nothing happened. There were political decisions, yes. We gave candidate status to Moldova, Ukraine, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, but there were no very concrete steps. And in order to overcome those fears, especially regarding the enlargement, we have to prove that it works. And we have to prove very concretely that it works. So I don't know if this, perhaps it was mentioned, opening all the chapters. Perhaps, I don't know. I mean, we need some new ideas to put on the table. We need to be innovative. Because, why? Because we need Western Balkan countries as much as they need us. And I think we realized this over the last year. We knew this, many of us knew this before, but I think everybody knows this now. So we should act, as I said at the beginning, we have a window of opportunity now. I think we should avoid big discussions and just start working on these processes.
Thank you. Very short, Minister Boone, and we can work down the line. 1-minute answers.
So I will pick up on the tensions between security and enlargement. I don't think there's a tension. I think we need to have a big European Union. an enlarged European Union for the security of the continent, but I don't think that European Union will be the European Union we'll have today. We will have to see where we put cohesion, agriculture, other policies, the reconstruction of Ukraine, which part of it. And for that, we will need to move away from a petty budgetary policy that is very national with rules to protect the money, to something that is actually designed to support the objective of the enlarged EU and perhaps of a core group of EU who wants to go into more integration. So no tension, but we need to work on a vision of the EU.
Daniela.
Yes, one additional point on that. I emphasized what has happened beyond the EU accession process in terms of stabilizing countries and relationships on our continent. And I think that is key as long as the EU has not gone through that process. Because at some point, the question will be, what is then the EU? And if you say the EU, or Natalie, I mean in that conversation, the EU may not be the EU we know today, then who owns the treaty core? Where is that base of a mutual primary law that has values and principles enshrined in it, and to whom does it apply? I think that will be the most crucial question, and at the end of the day, this is where member states all have to make their choice, and candidate countries as well. So which part do they integrate into? One point on the fears. So interestingly, our group was created on Franco-German initiative, and the composition is Franco-German, but our work has been trans-European from the start, because our own group meetings were very often enriched by guests we had. And in the beginning, we invited the guests, and as we got, as the political situation changed, as we discussed, more and more people wanted to speak with us and wanted to share their views, experts, decision makers, former decision makers. So we had a really European conversation throughout the month. Now, the fears that came up, in particular, sometimes from smaller member states, was really if the EU grows and decision making is made more efficient, how can we protect our national interest? Where are we? And this is not a comment on the work of the group in terms of recommendation, but just issues that were raised to us was composition of the commission. Will we have a commissioner? Should we? And of course, every country wants a commissioner. Then the question of qualified majority voting. Who can be overruled under which conditions? And how can safeguards be built into the process to protect core interests? So questions like this came up, and I think they partially respond maybe to your question. The other set of concerns was, indeed, if we enlarge too quickly, given our own internal fragilities, is there a risk that enlargement hollows out the union based on rule of law and democracy? So those, I would say, were the big topics that came up in conversations.
Thank you, Daniela. Minister,
It's
maybe pick one.
Yeah, it's evident that so we have to invest in enlargement, and we have to spread the space of freedom and security in the area of standards and values. But first of all, having in mind the situation and with Russia and alignment with the common foreign security policy, including the sanctions against Russia, has become increasingly important.
Minister, to your key concerns.
Well, our understanding is crystal clear. Nowadays, because of our shape, the European Union needs the Western Balkan more than the Western Balkan would need the European membership. So we have to be quick, and we have to give priority. We have to give priority to enlargement. And we are not doing very well because we have not been able to let Bulgaria and Romania join the Schengen area either, which is a shame, I have to tell you.
Thank you. Deputy Prime Minister Gabriel, your key concerns as you look at this process.
Well, first about the fears and tensions, maybe two things: not to create expectations that will easily become disappointment, and second, have the same conditions applied to all. And the example was just exactly said. What about the accession of Bulgaria and Romania to Schengen? There is a technical criteria. The European Commission said it for many years. It's really time now to advance and to show that the same criteria are applied to all. But when we talk about the fears, I think that we have just to simply to insist on from, through, for. We want to protect our citizens from what? Instability, unpredictability, dependence, influence. We have to address, we have to name these fears. Second, we want to address them through what? Policies, budget, legislation, and here I have a personal point of view. EU should stop to be only regulatory power, should be innovative power. And third, for strategic goals. That was one of the main issues here. We want to protect the interests of our citizens, and we want to be ready to adapt in a very fast changing world. And that's our strategic autonomy, actually.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to add plus one for what Tiago said about the institutional treaty reforms. That was one of the fears in Sweden. And so I was very glad that the discussions in Stockholm was more or less, everybody agreed, so, well, focused. So that is one, and the tensions is very different. Of course, I know all about the tensions in Sweden and amongst Swedes. And they're similar in other countries. But I think that is why I think we need to focus on what the EU is best on. For example, as I said, single market, rule of law, and we need to focus on that because it's in a hurry.
Thank you. 15 seconds, otherwise I'm in big trouble.
Very quickly, just on Natalie's question. Yes, I would say that maybe the trigger for the sense of urgency on enlargement and on reform was the whole security issue. But then when you start discussing it, you realize that we need to transform in a whole range of issues. And there, the more transformative dynamic comes in, because you do realize that in order to take on board more members, there's lots of things that you need to transform and need to be serious about reform. It's just not, some twists here or there. It's really about a transformative approach.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate our panelists' discipline, insight, and contributions. We've run out of time. I hope we made a small contribution to the debate and moving the ball forward ever so slowly. Lots of big decisions coming up this fall, and thank you again for joining us. We'll follow this space, and if the audience could give the panel a round of applause, please.